In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Tonight is our 25th class in our Orthodox survival course. I have to apologize. I don't have written notes ready because I left my computer at home. Some of our podcast listeners may not know that I live in Hillsdale, Michigan, but our church is in Rochester Hills, Michigan, which are over 2 hours apart, and I go back and forth. And this time I left my computer at home, so I was not able to prepare the written notes for today. But I have handwritten notes, and I hope to prepare some written notes later on. And also, since I don't have my computer, I don't have my regular recording equipment. We're recording on a couple of iPhones, and I hope the sound quality comes out well enough for everyone to hear the class clearly. Our class 25 is going to be devoted to catching up on some unfinished business from our last class and going on to a related but new topic. Our unfinished business was about a book called A Man is His Faith by Father Alexei Young, about the life of Ivan Kidievsky. And I was also going to read, our last class, going to read some beautiful accounts from the life of Tsar Nicholas I, which Father Seraphim relates in his lectures that start on page 57 of your PDF of the Father Seraphim lectures. And then after those corrections, or making up a couple of things here, I'm going to talk about some 19th century reactions to the 18th century rationalism that were not Orthodox, but were coming from non-Christian or pseudo-Christian or Roman Catholic sources. So last week, in our last class, we talked about an Orthodox response to revolution in the revival of the patristic literature and the vision of the Kireevsky brothers and Homiakov and the Slavophiles in general of an Orthodox society that incorporates the best of the Western achievement, but retains where the society retains the Orthodox identity. And this is, I can't repeat enough how important this is, that the unfinished business, you might say, the Orthodox nations in the 19th century was how to become modern, that is, being able to compete industrially, politically, militarily, and scientifically, and survive in the world and flourish materially to protect one's own people, to increase material prosperity of one's own people, and to guard one's own borders, and so forth. But at the same time, not lose the Orthodox identity, still have the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox faith and the inherited organic culture as the heart of the people, as the motivating principles, the motivating spirit of the people. And what I was talking today to Dr. Pitos, and he was relating his notes or his reflections on a book by Samuel Huntington called The Clash of Civilizations. Right? And Huntington's theory, of course, Huntington was responding to the so-called neoconservative theory formulated by a man named Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. History's over, the nations are done, the British and American hegemony is going to spread over the whole world, there's going to be a liberal new world order, history's over with, nations are finished, cultures are finished, we're just going to have worldwide McDonald's under the British and Americans, of course, or whoever's behind the British and Americans, whom we won't talk about. But Huntington wrote this book in response saying, nations are not finished, civilizations are not finished, and that you're going to see, and he was writing back, I think Huntington's writing back in the 90s, so he's kind of being prophetic in the sense of predicting all the pushback that's going on now of nationalism and popular discontent with the liberal hegemons who want to rule the whole world. But Huntington, my point of bringing this up, to get back to our topic, so Huntington said that the mistake of the Orthodox, he goes through the various cultures in the world. He goes through the British and Americans, the Anglos, who are basically the liberals, and he goes through the Western Europeans, who are the liberals. And then he talks about Islamic culture, he talks about the Chinese, and he talks about the Orthodox. He also talks about the Latin Americans and the Africans, who are kind of, they're last on the list. They're kind of the losers in the race, right? He says the Orthodox, he says, are not confident. He's a non-Orthodox, looking at us from the outside. He says the non-Orthodox are not confident because they have an inferiority complex about their religion and their culture. And he said the Orthodox are controlled by the West, he said, because they confused modernization with westernization. He said they didn't understand that they could have modernized, that is, they could have competed technologically and militarily without becoming Europeans or without becoming Americans. Now, he's an American academic just looking at us from the outside, and this is his observation. See? So it's this confusion of modernization, a necessary modernization, right? If you're going to have a war, you can't fight an army that has tanks with horses, right? You have to have tanks, right, and so forth. Okay. If you want to compete economically, you can't have a purely agrarian culture. You have to have industrialism, and so forth. But he said that they confused that, and they didn't retain their complete devotion to their faith and to their organic culture, and that's why they feel inferior, why they're not confident.
Or they were not allowed.
One way or the other. But that's what happened, you see. And so what Kirievsky and the Slavophiles were getting at was we have to incorporate the best of what comes from the Western achievement with the retaining of our Orthodox identity. But it has to start with the church, and it has to start with the repentance of the leadership of the church, and it has to start with the people returning, really making heroic or sacrificial efforts for their church and for their cultural identity. So that's why I brought up Kirievsky as in our last class as a very important figure, because he was saying we have to base. He had gone to the West. He had studied all the Western philosophies. He lived in and talked to the intellectual leaders of revolution, of this overturning of the old order in Europe. He was very familiar with the best of Western philosophy, and he saw through all of it. And he returned to Russia, had a deep conversion, and realized that only the profound understanding, the grace-filled understanding of the church expressed through the patristic literature, insofar as the literature is concerned, expressed through the patristic literature, in life expressed through guidance from holy men, which he found in the monasteries, that this is the basis for life. Life starts all the way on the inside, in the heart. And you correct the heart, and then it goes outward to the family, to the nation, and so forth. So it's all based on the solid principle of conversion to Christ in the true faith, the sacramental life, the life of prayer, the life of what Solzhenitsyn calls voluntary self-limitation, which Holy Fathers just call ascesis, or asceticism, podvig in Slavonic. And that this must be the basis for any Orthodox national life. And of course, if everyone was living this way, the nation would be very strong, because everyone would be self-sacrificial. But this is diametrically opposed to individualism. It's also diametrically opposed to collectivism, because collectivism, or the secular idea of the worship of the nation, is that everyone is just a robot or a cog in the machine. You have no personality, you have no identity, you have no inner life. You're just to be thrown into the machine, to be sacrificed for the nation as some kind of a god, right? Well, that's idolatry. That's not Christian. That's just idolatry. It's a form of paganism. And so in Orthodoxy, what we have is the true development of the person, which is in the spiritual life. And at the same time, because you become a true Christian, you do sacrifice yourself. But in sacrificing yourself, you don't become a faceless, mindless cog in a machine, but you actually become more and more truly yourself. And this is really only in Orthodoxy. And an essay that addresses this, how Orthodoxy is the true answer to the so-called conflict between collectivism on the one hand and individualism on the other hand, is an essay by the late Metropolitan Anthony Karbovitsky called The Moral Significance of the Dogma of the Holy Trinity. And he relates the oneness and threeness of the Holy Trinity to then the basis for an Orthodox society or Orthodox nationhood, in which, just as the Holy Trinity, each of the three is truly himself, but they're radically three and radically one. So in an Orthodox family, in an Orthodox parish, an Orthodox community, an Orthodox society, an Orthodox nation, following the teachings of the Church, under the guidance of the Church, everyone becomes truly himself and then more deeply united to those around him in love. And of course, historically, the basis for this in all true Christian societies, the basis of this was a life in the monasteries and the influence of the monasteries on the people. And we see in the West, as we saw in our earlier classes, it's when in the High Middle Ages in the West, the monasteries lost their influence, and that influence was replaced by the so-called teaching orders who gave us scholasticism, you see. And because the Franciscans, Dominicans, and so forth are not monks in the old sense of the first millennium. They're a new departure. See, and so the influence of the old monasticism was replaced by these teaching orders who were dedicated to the new scholasticism that at first ever so slight but critical and ultimately catastrophic departure from the patristic way of doing theology. And Kirievsky talks about this. So I'd like for everyone to get this book. A mistake I made last week was saying that a man for his faith is not in print. It is in print. I was looking at the wrong publisher. I looked at St. Herman's Press, and it wasn't there because I mistakenly thought St. Herman's Press had published it because it's been so long since I bought a copy. And so then I looked at Amazon, and it was like $250. But the actual publisher, St. John of Kronstadt Press in Liberty, Tennessee, has plenty of copies. And they're inexpensive. They're like $4.95 or $7, like that. So you just go to sjkp.org, and this is a beautiful book by Father Alexei Young about Ivan Kirievsky. And I mistakenly called it a booklet last time. It's not a booklet. It's a 60-page little book. It's a nice monograph on the life of Ivan Kirievsky, and more importantly, Kirievsky's thought, which is his life is emblematic and his thought is emblematic of what true Orthodox philosophy should be, so far as directed toward the rebuilding of Orthodox societies. So, Man is His Faith by Father Alexei Young, published by St. John of Kronstadt Press. Another mistake I made in my lecture last week is that I said that at Optina there were work days where they collated and bound the books. No, they did not print the books or bind them at Optina. The books, all the work done at Optina was the editing and translating of the work. They sent it off to publishing houses to be published. Another interesting thing I learned today, or was reminded today, is that besides the elder Makary of Optina, another towering figure in 19th century Russia who blessed, sponsored, and found the funding for Optina's project of publishing the Philokalia and St. Isaac and other works, was Metropolitan Filaret of Moscow. Just a towering figure in 19th century church life. So all these people were connected, and they did a great deal for the church. Last week I also had misplaced my notes from Father Seraphim, so I didn't have the beautiful stories from Tsar Nicholas I. So I want to finish that up from last class as well. Father Seraphim holds up Nicholas I as a model of a Christian ruler. He's quoting mainly from a book by Dr. Nicholas Thalberg, who was a professor in Jordanville. One of the important links in preserving the actual history of Russia and really Russian Orthodox religious publishing of any kind was that it all was, for a few decades, it was all concentrated at that little monastery in upstate New York. The Soviets had absolutely destroyed, wiped out Russian spiritual publishing. And Jordanville alone, the monks at Jordanville, with their printing presses that they'd hauled over from Czechoslovakia, rescued Russian Orthodox literature and learning for several decades.
But they're gone now.
Yes, they've been co-opted now, and they're getting rid of the old books. The old books are being purged.
I know who is one of the leaders.
Yeah. But they had Jordanville had a bumper crop of very erudite professors who were from before the revolution. They fled Europe. Some of them fled to Yugoslavia. Some of them fled the Soviet Union after World War II, and they were like you might say they were the last gasp of really the old pre-revolutionary Orthodox European intellectual. And one of them was, of course, Dr. Andreev, who wrote the Catacomb Saints book, Another was this Dr. Nicholas Thalberg, and he has a very important history of Russia, and I hope one day it's published in English. It's translated and published in English. But there are some pious accounts here of Tsar Nicholas I. And remember that this man was the ruler of 1/6 of the surface of the world. So he's responsible. He's an autocrat, right? Under God, he has absolute authority. So everything he does has enormous significance. So I want to read 2 stories that show the character of this man. There were a few incidents, Father Seraphim says, in the life of Tsar Nicholas I, which reveal a different attitude to the whole process of governing and the attitude of the king toward his subjects that is different from the Western or modernist idea. There was in 1849, quote, during the month of May, a parade in which 60,000 troops took part. Many spectators were present when, at the time of the ceremonial march, and then Father Seraphim says, of course, the Tsar is standing there ready to salute the soldiers. The Tsar is on his horse. He's reviewing all these soldiers. Right? The 2nd Battalion of the Yagersky Legion, in which Lvov was the leader, the sovereign, with his inimitable voice, which was quite loud, commanded, "Parade, stop!" The whole regiment stopped dead in their tracks. The sovereign, with a sign of his hand, stopped the music and called Lvov, the leader, out of the ranks. In the hearing of all, he turned to him and said, "Lvov, by an unfortunate mistake, you have unjustly and completely innocently suffered." And Father Seraphim explains, because earlier he had accused him, the Tsar had accused this officer of taking part in the conspiracy that Dostoevsky was caught in. Dostoevsky was in a circle there studying the ideas of Fourier. We'll talk about him tonight, Fourier. And it was a revolutionary sect, or a revolutionary group, committee that Dostoevsky involved in. And Lvov was unjustly accused of being part of this. He was mistaken for somebody else by the sovereign. And here and before 60,000 troops and many thousands of spectators, he apologizes. "I beg forgiveness of you before the soldiers and the people. For the sake of God, forget all that's happened to you and embrace me." Can you imagine that happening today? A scene like this. It's so touching. With these words, bending down from his horse, the sovereign 3 times kissed Lvov strongly. He gave him on Pascha, the ritual kiss, right? Having kissed the hand of the emperor, Lvov, who was thus made so happy, returned to his place. At the command of the sovereign, the march again began. This moment, says an eyewitness, for those who saw it and heard the voice of their sovereign, the feelings that filled their heart at that time cannot be called ecstasy. There's something beyond ecstasy. The blood stopped in your veins to see the sovereign of all Russia stop and ask forgiveness of a simple officer. See, the Orthodox spirit it's right there. You see. Then on another occasion, so he forgives, or he asks forgiveness. Okay. And this condescension, this love for this person, he's able to. The Tsar himself is very happy because he's able to humble himself in front of all these people, and he's happy. You see, he's having a moment of repentance and of showing Christian love. But sometimes he has to be hard, but he regrets having to be hard. Listen to this. There was a certain woman whose husband was imprisoned also in a revolutionary affair of some kind. She stopped him some place where he was looking at various institutions. Remember, life is so different then. You could just run up to the Tsar and stop him and talk to him. Can you imagine running up to the president? You'd be shot by the Secret Service. I mean, they'd grab you within 40 yards. They'd grab you. I mean, you'd be in jail the rest of your life, right? She stopped him someplace where he was looking at various institutions, and he allowed her to come and present a petition to him, and he began to read it. There was here a request to have mercy upon her husband, who had taken an active part in the Polish rebellion, which had occurred recently, and for this he'd been sent to Siberia. By the way, they were sent to Siberia under easy conditions, well, compared to later the Soviets. It was, in Siberia, under the Tsar's time, they had 2 meals a day, and they had church every day. Every prison had a church, and they had daily services, and they could go to confession. See, so even it was tough. I mean, I'm not saying it was a country club to be sent to Siberia, but compared to the communist prison, there's no comparison, right, to the Gulag, to the communist prisons. They had their own houses, they were well fed and so forth, especially the more aristocratic officers. They were just living basically almost under house arrest in exile somewhere in Siberia. The sovereign listened heedfully, and the woman sobbed. Having read the petition, the sovereign returned it to the petitioner, and he sharply declared, "Neither the forgiveness nor even the lightening of the punishment of your husband can I give." and he cried out to the chauffeur to keep going. When he returned, the sovereign withdrew into his office. Immediately after his return, there was a need for this one officer, Bibikov, to go to the Tsar with a report. There was a double door to the Tsar's office. Having opened the first door and intending to go into the second, Bibikov stepped back in an indescribable astonishment. In the small corridor between the two doors, the sovereign was standing and was shaking from stifled sobs coming out from him. Great tears were coming out of his eyes. "What's wrong with you, Your Majesty?" Bibikov mumbled. "Oh, Bibikov," he said, "if only you knew how difficult, how terrible it is to be unable to forgive. I cannot now forgive this man, but that would be weakness. But after some time, make another report to me about him." See, so as the king, for the sake of the state, he couldn't. The man was dangerous. He couldn't, for the sake of. He had to be just. But his Christian heart was so soft. And, Nicholas is known as, all the slanderers, the revolutionaries, the leftists all say he was a tyrant, he was ignorant, he was an obscurantist, blah, blah, blah. And here's the real man who has a Christian heart. And this is what they hate. They don't really hate that he was strict. They hate that he was a Christian. They hate that he was Orthodox. Okay? If only you knew how difficult, how terrible it is to be unable to forgive. Weeping that he couldn't listen, that he couldn't do what the woman asked. Okay, I cannot forgive now this man, but that would be weakness. But after some time, make another report to me about him. He's keeping the door open. See, this is really remarkable. It's really remarkable. And Nicholas I and then Alexander III were very, very strong, and this strength, this absolute intransigence, was what really saved their people. It's what kept revolution away, what kept revolution at bay. And the mistake of even well-intended sovereigns or well-intended conservative or traditional leaders is always to be too lenient. And they always listen to these ideas. So we have to be kinder to, the poor and the people and all this. And not really the poor and the people. They want them to be kind to the malicious ones who want to destroy the Orthodox order of society. So this is how, in our own country, here in America, this is how they've passed all of the destructive legislation, by appealing to the people's sentimental feelings about some poor refugee or some poor minority or some poor woman who couldn't have a legal abortion, and so she went and had an illegal abortion and she died. And they tell these stories, and you're supposed to feel sorry, and you're a bad guy if you don't cooperate with their program. And they keep pushing it and pushing and pushing it until people give in. These great rulers like this, who simultaneously had great Christian hearts, but they knew that their duty was to defend their people. They're absolutely intransigent. And it's intransigence. Intransigence means not yielding an inch. It's only absolute intransigence that will stop malicious movements. Only absolute intransigence will stop malicious. You have to recognize, first of all, you can't be naive. You have to recognize these people are completely malicious. And they don't mean anything that they say. They're just out for destruction. And you have to be absolutely intransigent and just say no to all of their plans, all their designs. So I just wanted to read that about Tsar Nicholas I. It's so edifying. The motto of Tsar Nicholas's reign that was held on to by his grandson Alexander III, it's a 3-word motto: Pravoslavia, Samodержavia, Narodnost. Pravoslavia, Samodержavia, Narodnost. Pravoslavia, of course, is orthodoxy. So the faith is first. The faith. Orthodoxy. The country must be based on orthodoxy. And then Samodержavia means autocracy. That the Tsar is a personal ruler. His mandate is from God, not from below, not from a sovereign will of the people, not from political parties, but from God. So you can absolutely rely on his authority. You see, it's not the result of the whims of factions or human ideas. It's from God. And finally, Narodnost. Narod is from rod. Rod is people, but rod is from the word meaning to give birth. For example, the Slavonic word for the Mother of God, Bogorodica. Okay. So the narod is the people of same birth. So the organic nation. Narodnost it's incorrectly translated as nationalism. Nationalism is a very abstract and harsh word. It doesn't. Nationalism conveys, you just think of people in uniforms marching in big parades and, saying that we're great, almost like a football match or something. Nationalism is very abstract. Narodnost means an intuitive, organic, profound sense of one's love and affection and loyalty to one's people, the soil that nurtured you, the water the water your mother drank that formed the fluid in the womb. All right, it's a most intimate human connection, not only to one's parents, but then to one's relatives in concentric circles of relationship, going both in space and then in time, going back in history. And this Narodnost, it's part of this, you might say, trinity of concepts, and the three together make an impenetrable fortress around an Orthodox society. You see, if you have the true faith, and then there's symphonia between the bishops and a king or a ruler who has the complete trust of the people because his authority is from God. And of course, there are bad ones and good ones, but the bad ones die, and then there can be a good one, But it's personal rule, but it's personal rule that's delegated from God, right? But in symphonia with the church, some of the Javia, the emperor's autocracy is never separated from Pravoslavia, from the church. So the church is always a check on his worldliness, and his might is a wall and a sword to protect the church, and sometimes to correct the church. How often have secular rulers who are more pious than the bishops have had to correct the church? You see. And then finally, Narodnost, which is this organic love of one's people, and which is one of the most natural, immemorial human feelings, and implanted in us by God. But so now we're going to contrast this now, and especially the concept of symphonia, this accompanying concept of symphonia, with these 19th century so-called religious reactions to revolution, or religious expressions of revolution in the West. Because in the West, there are many thinkers who realize, well, we can't just go around burning everything down and killing everybody. We have to the people, and we can't just have a religion of reason. The 18th century had this emphasis on reason, and it's really very abstract. And we know when the revolutionaries set up the goddess of reason's temple in Notre Dame is very stupid, and nobody can really be attracted to this. We need some real religion here. And this took the form in the West of, on the one hand, a kind of a pseudo-mysticism closely related to the Romantic movement in art and music and literature, that was related to a fantasy or an imaginary idea of the Middle Ages. So remember, from the Renaissance through the 18th century, they had put down the Middle Ages. Right? Those are ages of darkness, stupidity, just a bunch of monks running around, and the people were all ignorant, and now we have reason, right? In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, we have reason to rule us, and science and progress. We forget about the Middle Ages. But by the 19th century, and after the terrible destructiveness of the French Revolution, people realized, well, no, maybe the Middle Ages had something to offer. The centrality of religion, the centrality of the farming life, or community life, especially not just a man as part of an industrial machine, but as part of an organic community. And so there are various attempts in the West to try to recreate some kind of a community life on a religious basis. But of course, they failed, and some of them were stranger than others. I'm going to backtrack to Lecture 7. That Father Seraphim's Lecture 7. We've been drawing from Lecture 8 recently, but I'm going to backtrack to Lecture 7 and read something from Metropolitan Anastasi of the Russian Church Abroad. Metropolitan Anastasi is the successor to Anthony Krapovitsky. He took over in 1935 when Metropolitan Anthony reposed, and he wrote memoirs that he called A Conversation with My Own Heart, and he talked a lot about revolution. Because, of course, actually, Metropolitan Anastasi when he was the bishop who actually researched and then wrote up the service for the enthronement of the patriarch in 1918, because Russia had not had a patriarch for a couple of hundred years, and they didn't remember exactly how they did it. And says Michel Anastasi was such an important churchman that he's the bishop that the Holy Synod tasked with actually composing the service or putting together the service for the enthronement of the patriarch in 1918. And then he became the first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad. He says something about the light-minded character of the French Revolution. Now, I'm going back to the French Revolution and talking about this light-minded character to introduce the concept that carrying on from the French Revolution into the 19th century is the unfortunate or kind of grotesque reality that all of these reformers, all these great thinkers were poseurs. That is, they were acting, right? They were empty public personalities. It was all, as Shakespeare says, all the world's a stage, right? This is a huge stage. They were just acting. And remember, this goes back to a pathology that developed in the West in the High Middle Ages and then going to the Renaissance. Remember we read from when he was reading from, Father Seraphim was quoting from that German scholar about the cult of glory in Renaissance Italy. And this glorification of the individual and his desire for glory. And that what's going on the outside and what people think about you and how they're going to remember you and your moment of glory on the stage is more important than the actual inner meaning of your life. And this is going to be true of all of these so-called reformers, all these so-called visionaries. It's really empty, right? They're really acting. He says in the French Revolution, Maître Anastasi, in the French Revolution as in a mirror, the light-minded character of this people is reflected. It's striving for posing, for beautiful phrases and gestures inspired by vainglory. It's all vainglory, right? It's all vanity, right? All the heroes and ordinary activists in this revolution, even those moderate and serious of them, like the Girondists, remind one of actors who stand before the face of a numerous audience and think only about what their contemporaries and their descendants will think of them. They gave themselves over to orgies on the eve of being beheaded, so as to show by this their fake manliness of spirit. Many of them strove to have themselves painted in the carts, taking them to the guillotine. That was their last scene in this world. They were playing their last great scene, right? None of them thought about their responsibility before God, before history, or before their own conscience in this fatal moment for the country. This is going to explode in the Romantic movement of the 19th century in the glorification of the heroic individual. The glorification of the heroic individual, or the great thinker, the great genius. So what we have in the 19th century, early 19th century, with late 18th, early 19th century, with the transition from rationalism to romanticism, accompanying this is the cult of the creative individual, the great artist. Okay? Remember, for example, among musicians, until this period, a musician, no matter how great, was simply an employee of a nobleman. All right, he was a part of a noble court, or paid by a church. Bach, for example, one of the greatest composers of all time, was a church organist and choir director at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. He cranked out cantatas every week for the Lutheran services. That was his job, you see. And others had to be patronized by rich patrons. But starting in the 19th century, we started having the first superstars of music who are just glorified as individuals and become cult figures. What we call, super, as we say in 20th century parlance, superstars. You see, and this glorification of art and the glorification of the creative individual. Some of the people we're going to talk about tonight are superstars of utopianism, and they, in various ways, they're trying to get back to some kind of organic, or actually, of course, it's not really organic because they're making it up as inorganic, a mockery or a caricature of organic community through their utopian ideals being put into action in trying to create perfect societies. Father Seraphim talks about three of these characters. One is a Scotsman named Owen. Owen was influenced most of all by the previous experiments of Protestant utopian sectarianism. Protestant utopian sectarianism. Much earlier in the class of the Reformation, we talked about the Munster community. Some of these, and also the Anabaptists, the Anabaptist movement, where they create a separate little sect, and they try to live in this perfect little separate world. The United States is very productive of these groups. But in Father Seraphim's notes, there's very little about the United States. But actually, with the 19th century now, America's front and center, right, in the world stage. And in America, we have these kind of sects. The Shakers, has anyone heard of the Shakers? The Shakers were a sect in which they decided that to be perfect, everyone had to be celibate. And so they had whole celibate communities of men and women living separate from each other in the same compound but in separate buildings. And they would have, they were called Shakers because they would have a kind of a ritual dancing where they would kind of go into ecstasy through their dancing, and they would shake in their dancing.
Russia and Romania,
yeah, like the Dukobors in Russia, going back to the Bogomils in the Balkans and so forth. So there's nothing new under the sun, but this is but in the 19th century America, this is linked to other progressive social movements. So what does Owen do? Owen is from Great Britain. He starts a community called New Lanark in Britain, where the people are living all together. They get low rent, free medical care, schools, food at cost, and so it's a little carefully ordered community based on Owen's utopian ideals. And his ideas come from the millennial or utopian sects of the 18th and 19th century. Father Seraphim quotes some of them: the Ephrata community, the Moravian Brethren, even Adventism, Seventh-day Adventism in America was started as a health movement, right? It was Kellogg's cereals right here in Michigan started because the Adventists had all these specific dietary requirements. So the idea of making life on earth more perfect and creating a more perfect community through progressive dietary or ideals or labor ideals or family ideals and so forth. So Owen comes to the United States and buys the town of Harmony, Indiana, and renames it New Harmony. Has anyone ever heard of New Harmony, Indiana? It's still there. The community isn't there. New Harmony, Indiana was an attempt by Owen and his followers to create a perfect community full of bright people, where educated people from all over, enlightened people would come, and they would create a perfect utopian community, and then they would send out apostles, so to speak, missionaries, to create new communities everywhere. I just listened to a book by a man named Simon Winchester called The Men Who United the States. It's about men who made important scientific or technological advances that brought the United States into closer communication through transportation or communication technology and so forth. It turns out that this New Harmony community produced the men who went out and did the geological survey of the entire United States. See, so these in America, utopian ideals are there from the very beginning. Kind of chiliastic or utopian ideals are here from the very beginning, and the creation of the idea of a perfect community based on the ideals of some or another founder. So Owen is influenced by these previous Protestant sectarian efforts. Then there's another character that Father Seraphim talks about around the same time, named Fourier. Now, Fourier was the philosopher that Dostoevsky was studying with his friends when he got arrested. Fourier is not influenced by Protestant utopianism. Fourier is influenced just by revolution, and specifically by the ideas of Rousseau. Here's a teaching, according to Father Seraphim, one of Fourier's teaching is the free development of human nature through unrestrained indulgence of the passions, which will result in harmony. Can you imagine that? That he thought the unrestrained indulgence of the passions will result in harmony. And this discovery ranked him with Newton, the discoverer of gravity. Saint Simon, who we'll talk about later, also liked to be compared to Newton, right? He brought human knowledge to a new level, right? So Fourier is obviously these ideas are very dangerous, right? So this goes back to Rousseau's idea. Remember Rousseau's idea of le bon sauvage, the good savage, that man is naturally good, but the church and laws and society ruin man by giving constraints to his natural goodness, right? Instead of man being naturally fallen, and the church and the state being necessary to restrain his passions, right? So Fourier is really a revolutionary anarchist. He's still now in the straight revolutionary mode of thought. We'd have to just turn people loose to indulge their passions, and then we'll have this perfect society. But he also is aiming at the perfect society. Curiously, the young Dostoevsky was interested in Fourier's ideas. But again, Fourier saw this in a mystical light, right? He saw this as a religious movement. Fourier made fantastic prophecies of a future paradise on earth. Now listen to this. You're going to laugh, but serious people were reading this man. The sea would turn into lemonade. Men would be 7 feet tall and live to be 144. And listen to this, have 120 years of free love. So for a lot of these utopian thinkers, free love, in other words, no marriage, just following your passions, right, is very important, right? Men would progress. There'd be 30 million scientists as great as Newton and 30 million poets as great as Shakespeare. So this is obviously, absurd fantasy. People believed it. That's right.
You remember what I told you about that black guy?
No.
He said, I'm going to vote for the Communist Party of United States.
Oh, yeah?
And the reporter said, well, why? Because they told us that we'll be working half of number of hours with double salaries. Mm-hmm. Double salaries.
So that's it.
So okay.
People believed it. So think of someone that we admire as much as Dostoevsky, and he was attracted to Fourier's ideas. So again, these are competing chiliastic visions. I mean, Owen, the hardworking Scotsman, working with his English and American hardworking, hard-headed, practical people, want to create a utopian community based on hard work and scientific progress and so forth. But it's not as crazy as Fourier, but it's still wrong because it's not obviously not based on orthodoxy, and it's not based and doesn't accept the original sin. Right? It doesn't accept that man is limited, and that the important thing is to overcome our passions, and that we need enlightenment by God and by God's grace. Owen was very religious, but in the mold of a progressive or a liberal Protestant who believes that the gospel is simply an inspiration to make men better, right? And through science and through progress will make people better. Fourier is just apparently some kind of a lunatic, but he believed in Rousseau's idea, right? That we just have to give people free rein to their passions, and everybody will be happy. Okay, this is really at the basis of libertarianism, though. So-called libertarianism seems mild compared to Fourier, but at root is the same error, which is that men are not fallen, right? So in a libertarian, you have libertarians who claim they're conservatives, but they're the ones pushing for legalization of marijuana, which is going to make everybody stupid, right, and suggestible.
Just a mask.
Yeah. Mask. But some people believe it, though.
Well,
yeah.
You know so.
Yeah, some people believe it, right. Now, the final non-Catholic thinker I want to talk about is Saint-Simon. Claude-Henri de Rouvroy, Comte de Saint-Simon, was born in 1716, died in 1825. Saint-Simon also wanted to create a new world based on science. Okay, so again, the glorification of science. And but Father Seraphim says that he was most influenced by going back and reading. Remember Joachim of Fiore, the Catholic monk from the Middle Ages, who predicted the 3 ages, prophesied of the 3 ages and a future utopian society, an age of the Holy Spirit. Well, Saint Simon was influenced by this, but he was going to bring about the age of the Holy Spirit through scientific method and industrialism. he finally died in he didn't live to see his dream, right? But after his death, in the 1820s, his followers organized a church of Saint Simon. They actually called it a church. And at one time it had, according to Father Seraphim, it had like 40,000 followers. And the Saint Simonians were admired by very famous people. Heinrich Heine, the poet, the Jewish poet, right? Franz Liszt, the musician, okay, regularly attended the Sunday meetings of the San Simonian Church. Okay? So this is a pseudo-church being attended by these important artists. Okay? Carlyle, remember Carlyle? He wrote the history of the French Revolution I told you about. John Stuart Mill, very important thinker in Anglo-American economic theory. Okay, John Stuart Mill, along with Jeremy Bentham, are the utilitarians, the teachers that the economic theory that works best is that which benefits the greatest number of people. Okay, Saint-Beuve, George Sand, who is a female novelist, Lamartine, but however, Lamartine, Balzac, and Lamennais were suspicious. Of course, Balzac would be suspicious because he was fundamentally a conservative. Even Goethe, who criticized this Saint-Simonian thing, regularly received their newspaper, The Globe. By the middle of 1831, the new religion claimed 40,000 believers and was well known to every educated person in Europe. Now, we've never heard of it, right? You and I have never heard of Saint-Simon, but at this time, this is very important. Okay? So these people, the people following Saint-Simon, they're not advocating violent revolution, right? They realize that they can't just tear everything down. They want to create something new, but it's created on these false ideas of a religion based on science.
Without Christ.
Without Christ, of course. A religion without Christ. So this is secular chiliasm. Remember, chiliasm is from the term 1,000 to the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the idea of creating a perfect kingdom on earth. So all these ideas are going around, not just ideas, but actual movements, and large amounts of money and large numbers of people are involved in these movements. I'm going through some of these movements. These are not all the movements. They're ones that Father Seraphim highlights in his lectures, and I'm going through them to contrast them with the vision we talked about last week, based on the Orthodox patristic teaching as the foundation for society, which is based on being in the church and based on, by the help of God's grace, to overcome one's passions, right? To change the life of prayer. And then you can really love others. Then you can really create a society, but not a utopian society, never thinking you're going to create heaven on earth, which is the mistake of all chiliasts. Now, another thing going on in the 19th century is a Catholic revival. There is a strong conservative Catholic reaction in the 19th century. Father Seraphim talks about one of the main ideologues of the Catholic reaction, who was actually, people think he's a Frenchman, he's actually a Savoyard named Joseph de Maistre. Father Seraphim says he's Sardinian, but I think he was actually a Savoyard. He served the royal family of Savoy. And he actually was in the Russian court for a while as the ambassador to St. Petersburg. Let me quote Father Seraphim. De Maistre, who was born in 1753 and died in 1821, is an apologist for the divine right of kings, the 18th century concept. In fact, he even got somewhat embarrassed because his book on the divine right of kings was published without his knowledge. He wrote it several years earlier, and it was published just at the time when the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, accepted the Constitution. So poor Louis XVIII, who was restored by the Congress of Vienna, right, still accepted a constitution. So he became a constitutional monarch, unlike his, unlike Louis XVI, who was an absolute monarch. Therefore, this king thought he was against him. Okay, that's a funny incident from de Maistre's life. The aim of de Maistre's philosophy and of conservative philosophy, according to him, was to kill the 18th century. So he says it's all wrong. Voltaire, Rousseau, revolution, it's all wrong. Of course, he's right. It was all wrong. But his answer is the Pope. Right. He's a fanatical Catholic. So his answer is the Pope. De Maistre says, we see in this, quote Father Seraphim, we see in this de Maistre, who was the most fanatical anti-revolutionary, we see a very interesting thing. Because he was so very anti-revolutionary, at the same time was very rational, he came to new conclusions which were not in the European philosophy of the past. He's still an innovator. He's coming with a creative solution, right? He saw that revolution was a very strong movement, and you had to have something equally strong to oppose it. So what's his answer? He became the apologist for the Pope. And in fact, he said, without the Pope, there is no Christianity. He said, the Pope in himself is Christianity. That's an actual quote from de Maistre. The Pope is Christianity.
But in the West, because they didn't have the Orthodoxy, they have no other choice.
They have no other choice. The Pope is the only option. As if the Pope in himself entirely represents Christianity. So it leads to a new... Father Seraphim has an interesting observation. He says, de Maistre says, I'm traditional. But really, this is a new anti-tradition, because it's a rationalist absolutism. It's not an organic development, but a rationalistic, an ideological absolutism of the Pope. And so de Maistre was one of the chief people whose ideas related to and led to the doctrine of infallibility, proclaimed long after de Maistre's death in 1870, which is something new. So papal infallibility sort of is the climax of the whole, the apex of the whole papal ideology. And the other great figure associated with this is Pope Pius IX. Pope Pius IX started as a liberal. Some say he was a Freemason, but he had a conversion of some kind. And he went to being a radical anti-Mason, a radical anti-revolutionary, and became known as he's like the paradigm of the reactionary or anti-revolutionary Pope. He issued a famous document called the Syllabus of Errors, where he condemns, I think, 150 errors of the liberals and the revolutionaries. Okay. But Pius IX's, of course, solution is papal absolutism. So by trying to emphasize the Pope's authority so much to fight revolution, they topple over into another anti-Christian concept, right? Which is this almost a utopian idea of a Christian kingdom on earth headed by the Pope, or all of society is headed by the Pope. I don't know if this is true. I've heard Catholic friends who didn't like Pius IX say that he, Louis XIV said, "L'État, c'est moi," the state, that's me. Some people said, Pius IX once said, "L'Église, c'est moi," the church, that's me. But even if he didn't say that, that's more or less the effect of this, what's called extreme ultramontane thinking, of everything concentrated in the person of the Pope. So even though it on the surface it's a conservative reaction to revolution, it's really another, from our Orthodox point of view, we can see very easily that this is another utopian ideology that doesn't correspond to the Church's tradition and doesn't correspond to reality. Pius IX did suffer for his beliefs. The Italian revolutionaries almost assassinated him, and he did lose his kingdom. He lost the Papal States in the Masonic Revolution that overthrew the old Italian states and created the new United Italy, led by Cavour and Garibaldi and so forth. The Pope lost the Papal States, an area he had ruled for, I don't know, this is, 1,400 years. The popes had ruled in central Italy. And the Pope was locked up in the Vatican, basically was a prisoner in the Vatican, and until under the Mussolini government in the 1920s, Benito Mussolini, as the prime minister of King Victor Emmanuel, negotiated a deal where they created this entity called the Vatican City, which is actually a sovereign country under the rule of the Pope. So Pius IX and de Maistre represent this movement to papal absolutism. And also, Catholicism at this time was undergoing a return, you might say, a return to the Middle Ages in the sense of a monastic revival. The French Revolution had destroyed, probably thousands of monasteries, or at least hundreds, if not thousands of monasteries. And so there was almost no monasticism in France until one man, a man named Prosper Garanger, obtained the old abbey of Saint-Pierre on a place called Salem in northern France, and recreated Benedictine life. And and they're the monks who actually rediscovered and recodified the Gregorian chant. And everything the Catholics have today about Gregorian chant that officially is used in their churches is from this one monastery. But Dom Guéranger, again, was a radical papal apologist. He was a radical ultramontanist. So even their most important monastic movement was related also to the radical assertion of the superiority and the centrality of the Pope. So from our Orthodox point of view, of course, I mean, we can see how a Catholic would regard this as very traditional and very anti-revolutionary. But from our Orthodox point of view, we realize that the Pope, in a sense, was the first revolutionary, and that he usurped power in the Church to an illegitimate degree, and replaced. And also, this is not symphonia, right? In the papal ideal, or as we talked about in Boniface VIII's Unum Sanctum, issued in the early 1300s, it's not the old ideal of symphonia, where the Church and the patriarch or the Pope and the king and the king are cooperating with each other, but the Pope is actually above. The Church is above. The authority of the Church is above the king. See, and everyone ultimately is answerable to the Pope. And this is not pleasing to God, right? And it's not surprising that now the popes have shown their really true face, with the Vatican II popes, starting with Angelo Roncalli, John the 23rd. We have a succession of openly anti-traditional, openly heretical, openly modernist, and openly globalist popes. So the popes are using now, but because the Catholics now have been prepared for centuries to follow the Pope no matter what he does, the Pope now is an ideal tool of globalism to round up all the Catholics and get them to troop along to the global project, the globalist project. So now they have Pope Francis, who's very radical in saying that never talks about sin or penance or God's judgment or hell or the dogmas of the Church. He's always talking about, love and rights, and that it's the duty of Catholics to welcome all the Muslims to Europe. And the day that Ireland had this abortion referendum, the Pope was tweeting about the World Cup.
Yeah.
So this is this is a logical. This is not, Francis is not a break. Francis is the next step in this logical progression of the globalist project. But Catholics today would be, especially traditional Catholics, would be shocked for me to say, Francis is a direct development from Pius IX, but he is. See, because it's just one more stage in the Pope being the some form of a global or utopian figure, except it's turned upside down, right, into serving the revolution. What's interesting, some of you may have heard of Archbishop Lefebvre, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He founded what's called the Society of Pius X, St. Pius X, and it was to fight the new Mass and to keep Latin and so forth. It's still around, although it's much weakened since his time. But he says, after the changes occurred in the Catholic Church after Vatican II, Lefebvre said he remembers being in the seminary in the 1914, 1915, and one of his professors said at that time to the boys in the seminary, he said, "You will see they are going to use the dogma of infallibility to make an idol out of the Pope, and the revolution will use the Pope to advance the revolution." And that's exactly now what has happened, starting with John the 23rd, and they signed a concordat with the Soviets, which had never happened before. And now we have Francis, who's just openly promoting cultural anarchy, sexual license, multiculturalism, so-called, and the invasion of Europe and America by the Muslims. So these are some of the non-Orthodox, getting back to the 19th century, these are some of the non-Orthodox movements that were going on in the 19th century that Father Seraphim speaks of in his lectures.